Hello, welcome to video 2 of our week. And let's continue with our discussion on angiosperms. This is a picture of the exact same thing. What? Yeah, it's just the same thing in 2 different stages of development. The thing that's labeled B here, well, I'm not sure if B is indicating just this top little thing. I'm imagining B is indicating this whole structure here. That is the ovary inside of a flower. Now, in this particular flower on the left, somebody has sort of removed some of the structures so that we could see that ovary inside of the flower. But it's that ovary that produces ovules, and then the ovules become seeds inside of a fruit. And I know when you think of a fruit, you often think of something that's juicy and delicious. But the truth is that many angiosperms produce fruits that are woody or papery or sort of open and dry like you see here. And that's how they release their seeds. So they don't always produce juicy, delicious fruits, and that word fruit has multiple definitions, but I'm going to be using that word fruit in a very specific way today. It's going to be in light of the botanical definition, which is a matured ovary. Okay, let's get to it. Learning goals. Be able to explain and diagram flower structure and function as well as fruit structure and function. I'm not sure if you really want me to read these to you guys all the time, because they're there. Oh, but then they end up in the transcript. I probably should read them. Be able to explain the potential advantages of how pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal occur in angiosperms relative to gymnosperms. Be able to explain the general concept of how angiosperms co-evolved with animals, mostly insects. Know the position of the angiosperm clade within the larger plant tree. And by tree there, I do mean cladogram. And then know the synapomorphies that identify angiosperms. Okay, here are your terms to know for the week. This is in addition to the ones from the Angiosperm Part 1 video. Some of these actually do overlap. Not many. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. Okay. Wow. So, flowers. We all know they're amazing. Flowers are some of the more charismatic organisms on the planet, really. I think humans evolved to sort of believe that flowers exist for our pleasure. You know, they smell sweet, they look beautiful, they're intricate. Sometimes they have certain properties that we enjoy. But really, flowers exist solely to just produce gametes and to produce seeds and get your babies into the next generation from the plant's perspective. But their way of them kind of moving these gametes around, their eggs and their sperm cells, it's not by, well, namely the sperm cells within pollen grains. They don't move them so much using wind. Well, they do sometimes. But really, angiosperms evolved to move their pollen grains around using insects. They attract insects with something just like they attract humans, with a smell or a sweet nectar taste or pollen that's nutritious. And really, that's a reward where the plant is really just kind of duping the animal into really doing sex for it. It's moving those pollen grains around from one individual to another. Namely, those pollen grains are going from one flower to the stigma of another flower. Preferably an unrelated flower, right? From the plant's perspective. But animals do tend to get rewards from this. Okay, so that's the flower side of the story. The other side of the story, though, is the fruit. The part of the flower that becomes a fruit is the ovary. And so here, even this acorn, even these dandelion wishes, if you will, even a blueberry, these all arose from flowers. Believe it or not, even your cool maple helicopter, which I'm from the Midwest, and we know about the maple fruits very well out there. But if you don't know about these, look up a maple fruit. They have this really cool way of catching the wind and dispersing pretty far distances by sort of helicoptering with that wing. Anyway, even those started off as a flower. So the point of a fruit is to enhance seed dispersal, right? We've got a seed inside of even this dandelion wish over here. Really, it is a fruit with a seed inside of it. Yeah, even this acorn, it's a fruit. Changed my mind. You can't. It is a fruit. Opuntia berries, or so they're known as. These are also fruits, and maybe you've noticed if you've ever seen the way an opuntia berry grows. It basically starts off as a flower, right? And then that flower becomes this fruit. Well, it's not the whole flower that becomes the fruit. It's just the ovary. So let's talk about what a flower is. Believe it or not, a flower is a modified shoot. What? Well, what's a shoot? Remember, a shoot is a stem and leaves. That's all a shoot is. All right. Really, a flower is a modified strobilus. In fact, a strobilus, the cone structures that hold seeds, or like a strobilus that'll hold spores. Those are also highly, highly modified shoots, and a flower is an even more modified version of a strobilus. What? Okay, I know, that sounds wild. How is it modified to become a flower? Well, evolutionarily speaking, the first step is to make it stop growing. So we've got a shoot tip, and it is now determinate. It stops right there, and now we've got this location. It's a shoot tip, and this is the location that's called the receptacle, and this is the spot where 4 whorls of highly, highly modified leaves are attached. And it's wild that these are actually leaves, because these 4 whorls of modified leaves are what we know of as a flower. Yeah. The outer whorl is the sepals. The next whorl in are petals. And then we've got stamens, the male reproductive parts. And then on the inside, we've got carpels. Now, there's a couple names for the female reproductive parts of a flower. I already told you that word pistil in the previous video. We've got carpels. We've got gynecium. From our perspective, they are more or less interchangeable. They all mean the female reproductive parts, okay? When it's important to distinguish between them during this video, I will do so. I just wanted to let you know there's multiple ways to say that female whorl. That female whorl, though, it's always the 4th whorl. Or in other words, it's always the centralmost or the topmost, the middlemost whorl. And the stamens, the petals, and the sepals are always surrounding the carpels in that very particular order. There's always these 4 whorls. This is sort of the ancestral condition of all flowers. Now, some flowers are highly, highly modified, and maybe they've lost a whorl or 2. There are some flowers out there that are entirely unisexual, and that would mean that maybe a plant produces male flowers that don't have carpels on one part of the plant, and then they produce female flowers that don't produce stamens on either a different part of the plant or on a completely different plant. That can happen too. But this is the typical flower that really all flower forms have this condition of 4 whorls in this order. Okay. Now, I say this over and over again, and I really am emphasizing this point because it's amazing. It's the unifying theme of all angiosperms, all 350,000 flowering plants that we know of. I mean, imagine, a lily and an agave and a rose and a buttercup and a magnolia and a mint flower. They're all different. They're all different versions of this exact same pattern, and it's a pretty cool thing, I think. If you can't tell. All right, the base of that structure, which we call a flower, it's either the pedicel or the peduncle. I love those words. Just kind of depending on the situation. But we can call it either one for now. Okay, the stamens, really, in theory, the stamens are microsporophylls, which are just highly modified leaves that bear microsporangia. And in the case of angiosperms, microsporangia are literally those pollen sacs that bear pollen grains. And then carpels, on the other hand, they're really highly modified megasporophylls because they're bearing megasporangia, namely the megasporangia which have ovules inside of them, or an ovule, rather, inside of them. Excuse me. So the carpels are where kind of all of the really exciting stuff happens because these are what develop into the fruits. And so we do need to talk about those three parts of carpels again. We've got the stigma at the top. It's always going to be that topmost structure up there. Okay. And then the style, it's not always elongate like this. It is in both of these pictures. It's just the space sort of, it usually is, like I said, it's usually elongate and it's sticking that stigma out into space maybe so that the stigma can be closer to potentially getting pollen grains, coming into contact with the pollinator. But the style is just the space in between the stigma and the ovary. The ovary, the bottom here, the ovary is, the area of the ovary is defined by the area that is bearing ovules. So if we look at a little cross section like they've done here, we'll see ovules. And sometimes carpels are just sort of like this. They're simple where they've just got this sort of like one chamber inside of them. But other times they're like this where it's one sort of structure, but it's got these two chambers inside of it. 1, 2. And each chamber is bearing multiple ovules. Okay. Well, these are just kind of different structures. It's just wanted you to know that sometimes we actually have 2 fused carpels, or maybe 4 fused carpels, or 10 or 20 fused carpels. I don't know. You can have any number of fused carpels, or you could just have a single carpel. They exist in different species. Wherever the ovules sort of come into contact with the ovary wall, that sort of connection space is the placenta. And that's a convenient term. It means something similar, of course, in placental mammals. Sort of the connection between the mother and the embryo, if you will. In fact, it's a very similar structure. Even kind of, it's interesting. It's even like the ovary even kind of swells up like a mammalian pregnant belly with offspring inside. Pretty cool. Similar convergent evolution there. Anyway, sometimes carpels are fused and sometimes they're not. We have all sorts of different looks of carpels in the hundreds of thousands of species of angiosperms. So the one that we looked at earlier was sort of like this. Notice this ovary down here, it's very elongate. Okay. While this one over here, it's kind of globular and plump. Yeah. This one over here on the right, though, notice we've got totally separate carpels. Kind of hard to see in this picture, and so I'm kind of trying to show it by showing that these carpels are not connected to one another. Okay, so we can imagine kind of like this diagram up here, those ovaries are completely separate from one another. This is only important because the orientation of the carpels with one another, right, whether they're unfused like they are here, or whether they're fused, sort of like they are here. We've got 3 fused ones. This will determine sort of what the potential fruit types that they will be able to form in the future, because right, the ovary is what's going to become the fruit. And so in this case where we've got these separate ovaries over here, well, we're going to end up with these separate fruits. While over here we might end up with this one fruit. Maybe it'll split into separate parts or something like that, but okay, moving on. There are other whorls that can be fused. It's not just the carpel. So we talked about the petals and the sepals and the stamens earlier. Well, yeah, in this case up here, we've got actually fused petals. Same with down here. We've got the fused petals. There's the ones down here are so fused that they sort of are forming a little room around the sexual parts, and we can't even see them except for just that little style and stigma that's sticking out of them. Very cute. Okay. And then over here, we've got, it looks like we've got fused stamens. Notice like down here, we've got this kind of one tube structure. And then all of these anthers And little stalks are coming off of this tube-like structure. So it appears in this picture as though we've got fused stamens. Cool. Lots of hibiscus, by the way. And if you're wondering, that's a morning glory. And that is probably an arbutus of some sort. But also could be a manzanita. Okay, we have a lot of different ways to sort of identify flowers. Like I said, there's hundreds of thousands of species of them. And so when we need to sort of distinguish between species, we're trying to identify something. Well, one of the things we look at is, of course, are all of the whorls present? How many petals do we have? How many stamens do we have? Are those carpels fused? And then here's another thing we look at. What is the symmetry of the flower? So on the left here, we've got radial flowers. Radial just means we've got three or more planes or three more lines of symmetry. So if I draw a line right here down this flower, notice I just drew more or less a line where we've got a mirror image on both sides. I've basically got 2.5 petals on either side. 1, 2.5. And I've got the exact same mirror image on both sides, right? The circle and the little things. Cool. Same with down here. Or excuse me. Let me do something else up here on this flower. I could also do a plane of symmetry. Oh, right here. Or I could do it right here. Notice I could do it here, here. There's many places where I could do this line of symmetry and have a mirror image on both sides. I know those lines weren't perfect, but hopefully you kind of get the idea. And that is as opposed to a flower like this. There is only one line that I can draw where there is a mirror image of this flower on both sides. Right, and it's right there. Imagine if I were to draw a line like right here, connecting those two arrows that I just drew. The top image would be very different from the bottom image. Notice we've kind of got a little extra fancy structure on the bottom that wouldn't be on the top if we drew a line that way. Okay, well, same thing on the left down here. We've got another picture of a radial flower. It doesn't really matter how many petals there are. It's just how many planes of symmetry are there? Are there 3 or more? If so, then it's radial. Notice this one down here, this little pansy, also known as a violet. It only has one plane of symmetry. By the way, this structure right here, that's the fruit of this flower. Snuck that in there. So I wanted to just show you another look of a flower. This is called a fuchsia flower, and actually these are kind of flowering. It seems like year-round, more or less, in Arcata. There are definitely still some flowers around town right now. If you are in Arcata, you can walk around and find some of these, I'm sure. Maybe even on campus, if you're wearing your mask. Well, we've got all of the layers that we talked about. They just look kind of different from earlier. The very outermost layer here, these are the sepals. And now in this picture on the right, what I've done is I've taken a razor and I've sliced this flower right down the middle like that, okay? So we can see inside of it. And so there's that outer layer that I just highlighted over here. Those must be the sepals. Okay. These purple tinged things that are round at the tip, those must be the petals then. So those are the two outer whorls. And then the two fertile reproductive whorls are inside of that. So we've got a bunch of stamens here. And then it's sort of hard to tell the difference between the stamen and the style, because the style is also elongate. Remember, the style is sort of part of the carpel, the female part. But I can tell that at least this part right here must belong to the style and therefore the female reproductive part. So there's the style all the way up there. And that's probably the top of it, the stigma, because it looks a little sort of juicy, which the stigma does sort of tend to be sticky sometimes in order to catch pollen grains. And then there's the ovary down there, bearing ovules. Cool. All 4 whorls. The sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels. Here's another look at a flower. Here's a buttercup. And what I've done is here's a top-down view. We're up here up top. Okay. And now if you flip it upside down, what you see are those 5 sepals. And now I've removed them, and now you can see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. And then if you flip that over and zoom in a little and remove some things, here's sort of, I've removed like 1 or 2 or 4 rather of these stamens. So there's the top of the stamen, the anther, and then here's the bottom of the stamen, that filament. Now, this picture on the right here, in this picture, I'm just zoomed in on that central part. And in this picture, we actually have a bunch of free, separate carpels, right? All of these little kind of tops here, these are little stigmas and styles. And if you follow them each down to their base, you could potentially tear them apart from one another, or not even tear them. You could remove them from one another because they're separate. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. And that's this right here, this little pom-pom looking structure is the fruiting head of this flower. So in other words, this green pom-pom looking thing is just the older version of that buttercup flower. It's the fruits of the ovaries of that flower, specifically. Okay, here's just some references I wanted you to have. Everything we've talked about, just reviewed. Okay, so pollination is the transfer of a microspore, namely a pollen grain, which contains the microgametophyte and sperm, onto the stigma of a carpel. Or, remember, the carpel is also known as a pistil, depending on the situation. So in other words, we've got pollen grains coming into contact with stigmas. That is pollination. Pollination vector is the transport agent for the pollen, and so there's some abiotic pollination vectors like water and wind. Wind is, remember, what the gymnosperms use as their pollination vector. But angiosperms really bank on the animals because they're more effective pollinators than the wind. They don't have, or rather they do have preferences, and so they will kind of always go from flower to flower. While wind, it doesn't have a preference, and so it's not necessarily going to go from flower to flower. It's just blowing around wherever it so happens to be, where air pressure is lower or higher or whatever the situation is. It's not going towards flowers like animals do. Cool. In fact, plants can really attract attract animals to make sure that they come to their flowers. So pollination is what happens, like I said, in angiosperms. It's when animals are kind of moving the pollen around from plant to plant. But plants and animals have very different interests in the process of pollination. Plants, they're having their pollen transferred from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of another flower. In other words, they are having sex done for them. They're moving those pollen grains that have sperm cells over to a stigma, which will lead them to an egg cell. Animals, they're also part of the pollination story here, but they have no idea that they're doing this for plants. You know what I mean? They're not thinking about that. They're like, oh, I'm going to grab the pollen from this flower and bring it over to the stigma. No, they're like, I'm hungry. I need nectar. Or maybe there's something that eats pollen. Then that's where they're going to go to. Or maybe they're just duped. Maybe they just sees like bright pink showy flower attracted and they go, and then there's not even any nectar or pollen there for them. So sometimes flowers can do that. Or maybe it's just sort of random. No interest whatsoever. You can pause and read this if you'd like. It turns out that there are different pollination syndromes. There are these sort of correlated sets of traits that are found in flowers that are pollinated by a particular specific type of pollinator, like beetles, for example, or bees. So, for example, bee-pollinated flowers tend to be, blue or purple or lavender, while bees, they tend to be able to see, blue and purple and lavender. And so there are definitely these strong correlations. And here's another, again, you can pause here and read these up close if you want. So it's like, these are kind of correlated here. Each line is correlated with one another. Well, actually, not always, I guess. Good sense of smell. White. Fragrant. Yeah, cool. Well, some angiosperms sort of reverted back to wind pollination. Not a ton. Things like grasses, alders, oaks. Over on the right, we have cannabis, which is actually a really good example of some of the qualities of wind-pollinated flowers. So the male side of the story, we tend to have many really large, dangly anthers, as you can kind of see here. Lots of them, and even over here, you can see actually a bunch of, you can't see the anthers themselves, but you can see their products. We've got massive clouds of pollen being released from the copious amounts of anthers on those oak leaves. And then also on the female side of the story, the stigmas, which actually really this is just a highly modified, highly reduced flower. The stigmas of wind-pollinated flowers tend to be very sticky. And sometimes they tend to be very plumose, kind of feathery, sort of so that they have a more expanded surface area so that they can increase the probability of coming into contact with one of those pollen grains from another individual. So we see really long stigmas over here too in other sort of organisms that have wind pollination. Another type of pollination that we tend to see would be those that will be kind of bright cues for specific animals. So, for example, bees can sort of see UV light better, and certain other organisms can see UV light better. And so, actually, if you shine a UV light on certain flowers, different patterns will show up that we can't see with our naked eye that insects can see. Okay, and sometimes we've got these spots. Sometimes we've got sort of an area for them to land. But this thing on the right, this is a really spectacular version of what can evolve over millennia, over thousands of generations. What evolved here was a flower that looks like an insect. Yes, you're seeing this correctly. That is not an insect. That is actually just a flower. We've got sort of the petals here. These are all just petals. We've got hairy, fancy, colorful petals down here. We even have these little things that sort of resemble eyes. Well, this whole entire flower together, it resembles the female bee of a species of bee whose male counterparts are particularly good pollinators for this orchid species. So they're really just banking on the visual cues that they know males will be attracted to. Okay, lots of other pollination syndromes. If you're interested in this, I recommend that you look this up. There's lots of cool information on the internet about relationships between pollinators and flowers. Not everything is kind of beautiful and showy from a human's perspective. Things like flies, they're really interested. They think smells like rotting meat or feces smell delicious and amazing to them. And so sometimes flowers will smell, from a human's perspective, bad. Like this flower in particular, you can even kind of tell the way that it looks that it probably smells bad. It's actually trying to resemble rotting meat or some sort of carcass, because this is a fly that's interested in laying its eggs in carcasses. And so this flower probably smells like that. And sometimes other flowers of different species that have evolved this pollination style, maybe they'll even be hairy, sort of like a little dead mammal or something. Yeah. This over here on the right, this is a very spectacular flower. It's actually the largest flower in the world. It's called Rafflesia. I'll spell that for you in case you're interested. Rafflesia. And it's that's a really special flower, not only because it's the biggest, but also because it's entirely parasitic. It does not produce any of its own leaves. and of its own, photosynthetic leaves, and instead it is parasitic on nearby plants and fungi in the area. Crazy. Other pollination stories, birds, mammals, so it's not all about the insects, even though insects are definitely the original, the OG pollinators, if you will, for the angiosperms. Birds, mammals, they also have banked on it, though, and they are able to get resources from flowers. This picture on the right, or in the middle, this is a picture of a hummingbird tongue. So hummingbirds, they can see bright colors. They require an incredible amount of nectar to beat those tiny wings so fast, rapidly. They need a lot of nectar. And so they tend to visit flowers that provide them with a lot of nectar. And these long tubes sort of restrict other organisms from being able to get all of that nectar. And so these are really hummingbird-specific flowers, sort of tend to look like this with a tube. Have lots of nectar, tend to be brightly colored. Okay, we have bat-specific pollen syndromes. Cool. Okay, next topic I want to talk about are inflorescences. Here, Holmes is showing off a little lupin raceme, it looks like, sort of right here. And what an inflorescence is, what that term means is, it's a term that means a cluster of flowers. So again, right here, I have this sort of stalk of flowers that's right in front of Holmes there. And, we have a bunch of these sort of stalks of flowers. Well, each one of those is an inflorescence. And the way that flowers are arranged with one another, this is another one of those identification tools that's used, just sort of like the symmetry of a flower or the number of petals or whatever. The way the flowers are arranged is also a thing. You definitely don't need to know all of these words, but it's cool to have as a reference, because what you might end up needing to do someday in your life is to identify a plant. And even though you might not know what the words mean when you first see them in an identification guide, you can always look them up. That's one of the most, I think, important skills that you learn as a botanist is to be resourceful. You can't learn it all. There's 350,000 species. You simply cannot learn all of it. And so you've got to know where you can look it up. And, you can save this file. You can know that these things exist. And, yeah, that is all. Okay, something that we tend to see in inflorescences is, well, sometimes we see clusters of flowers and then sort of a fractal, like another layer of it. So here, this is an umbel. Again, you don't really need to know that specific type, but it is an easy, fun one to learn. There's the peduncle. Ooh, there's that word again, that stalk of a cluster of flowers. And then notice all of these flowers. So these are flowers. Like there's one flower right there. I know, because when you look really closely, you can see the stamens. You can see those petals. Even in the middle, there's the ovary. Okay. So each one of these is a flower. There's a flower. There's a flower. Each one of those that I just circled, those are all flowers. And they're all coming from this one point. So that means this is an umbel. Cool. Over here, we have a similar situation where we have a bunch of things coming from a point. But this time, you can't tell from this picture. But I just kind of want to tell you this anyway. What's going on here is we have, a dozen or so flowers right there. Not just a dozen or so stamens. That's not just one big flower with a bunch of stamens. That's a dozen or a couple dozen tiny, tiny, tiny little flowers. Oh, and there's another dozen or so tiny little flowers. Anyway, we have multiple levels of umbels in this situation. Okay? So we've got sort of the main level here with the larger radiating stalks, but then at the ends of those we have tiny little stalks, and each one of these tiny little stalks has a little flower attached to the end of it. Yeah, cool. So anyway, this is a compound umbel, while this is just a plain old-fashioned umbel. And you can have compound all sorts of things, compound panicle or compound cyme, or And this picture on the right, this is another very fancy type of inflorescence called a head inflorescence. And this next slide, I'm going to describe a head inflorescence a little bit, and it might blow your mind if you don't know this yet. What I'm about to tell you is pretty mind-boggling. You ready? Okay. A sunflower, like what you're seeing here. Or if you want to, you can picture a daisy. Same thing, basically. A sunflower is not a flower. No. A sunflower is hundreds of tiny, tiny flowers. Together, they make up this one large inflorescence that resembles a single flower. What? Yeah. So when you look really close at a sunflower or a daisy, it's actually a bajillion of these tiny, 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 tiny little things called disc flowers. And then, all of these structures on the outside, these radiating large yellow things that look like petals, they are petals, but they're petals for their entire own flower. So, like, that's one flower and its petal. That's one flower and its sort of set of petals. That's one flower. That in the back there, that's one flower. And same thing here. It's just that its reproductive parts are so tiny you can't see them, but they're like right there. Like there's the reproductive parts for this flower. And there's the reproductive parts for that flower. You get it? Okay. Each one of those in the middle too is an entire flower. A sunflower is hundreds of flowers, meaning a sunflower, that thing that you think of as one big flower, it's actually an inflorescence called a head. And we know that because when we look inside of it, actually a dandelion is the same story. So if you know what a dandelion is, you can go grab one, maybe even outside right now. They're kind of everywhere all the time. And notice that this is sort of a zoomed in version of what's going on right here. Yeah, right here. That's the ovaries. Each one of those is a separate ovary of a separate flower. So it's like that is one flower, what I just drew. And then like this is one flower. That is one flower. It's just that the whole flower has this long petal structure that looks like its own petal, but really it's attached to an entire flower. And we know that when we look closely here, we can see those little stigmas. There's those little two-parted stigmas. Wow. Okay, moving on. So a fruit develops from a flower. This is crazy stuff. Every fruit you've ever had started off as a flower. Something like this, a little blackberry or even a raspberry, salmonberry or marionberry. They're all the same, really. They're all in genus Rubus. They all started off looking like this. And those ovaries, you can kind of start to see them peeking through here. The ovaries start to swell up once pollination and fertilization have taken place. And by the time the seeds are fully mature and ready to be dispersed, so that the sporophyte can grow from the embryo of the seed, then the fruit is going to become ripe, and it's going to either be attractive to some animal to hopefully be ingested, or somehow those seeds are going to get out. So this is a mind-boggling thing. Like I said earlier, even corn, a single corn kernel is the ovary of a flower. And yes, it started off as a flower. Wild. A watermelon, it started off as a flower. A pumpkin, a squash, that's a fruit. Yeah, because it's the matured ovary of a flower. Tomato, changed my mind. It's a fruit. Obviously, okay, blueberries, raspberries. Kidney beans, that's a questionable one. Beans, they're seeds, they're inside of fruits. The whole thing, the whole structure would be the fruit. Oh, for example, in the back there, string beans. That is a fruit. A string bean is the matured ovary of a flower. It is a fruit. Moving on. We think of these as your typical fruits, right? And some fruits are much more complicated than others. Now, I have to tell you this word, since this is botany, pericarp, P-E-R-I-C-A-R-P. This is literally just another word that means sort of the fruit wall. F-R-U-I-T, that's a U, fruit wall. Okay, so it's sort of everything in a fruit that's not the seed, basically. And in things like this, like your tomato or your peach or something, it's the part that's fleshy, or sometimes it's the part that's hard. So the pericarp, sometimes you'll see in botany textbooks, they split it into exocarp and mesocarp and endocarp, and those are very interesting terms, and it's cool if you wanted to learn them on your own, but we don't need to know them for this class. But if you did learn those terms, you would notice that there's a difference between something like a berry and a drupe. Well, you don't even really need to know those terms to know that a peach has a big hard thing right in the middle, right? This thing called a pit. And that's part of the fruit itself. There's a seed inside of that pit. And so, okay, so we've kind of got different pericarps, and those will differentiate between our different types of fruits. But really, I'm not going to require you to know any of the fruit types specifically, except for berry. I want you to know the word a berry. Now a berry, you might know, like a blueberry. It's just something that's fleshy throughout. Okay, a fruit that's entirely fleshy. A watermelon, for example, is an example of a berry. A tomato is a berry. Changed my mind. It's fleshy throughout. It's got seeds inside of it. Started off as a flower. Even an orange or a grapefruit or lemon, it's wild, but it's just a really highly modified type of berry. I mean, shoot, even a pumpkin is a berry. Really? A banana? An avocado? These are berries. Grape? I'll tell you something that's not a berry, though. A strawberry. This should not be on this page. Strawberry is absolutely not a berry. What? Yeah, it's true. A strawberry is actually the thing that you eat. So delicious. Red, juicy, fleshy. This whole thing that you eat, that's a strawberry. It's actually a giant enlarged receptacle. And then all of these, remember a receptacle, by the way. A receptacle is sort of the base of a flower where the four whorls are all attached to each other. And so on the strawberry here, right, we have all of these little leafy, crispy structures down there. Oh, those are the old sepals. And then all these structures on the outside. Sorry, you can't see it because they're in red. But all these things that you might have called seeds your whole life on the outside of a strawberry. Those are the fruits. Those are the matured ovaries. If you look at the flower of a strawberry, you would notice that there are many ovaries, and those ovaries, you can see sort of in the development, I'm sorry, this picture is so tiny, but in this tiny picture, and this one down here as well, this is the flower, okay? And then in the very middle of the flower, we have a bunch of these tiny free ovaries, and they get pushed to the outside by this large expanding receptacle. And that's what becomes fleshy and delicious and attractive to seed dispersers like, squirrels and people. So it really, that term fruit, it has a very, very specific meaning in the botanical world, and it's a matured ovary. And in strawberries, the matured ovary are simply those tiny little seed-like structures on the outside of a big, red, fleshy receptacle. I really hope that blew your mind. Pineapples are also kind of a crazy type of fruit that I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of, but I'll just say this. Each one of these little units was at one time its own separate flower. Wild. Okay, so a lot of fruits, their main function is sort of to attract an animal to ingest them. And then, of course, the rest of the story. It's going to go through their digestive tract and be pooped out somewhere. And hopefully at that stage, it's sort of the seed coat has been properly, it's been dealt with by the digestive system. And so it's ready to germinate, or maybe it's kind of been fertilized, if you will. And gets placed into a place probably pretty far away from the parent plant, since it takes some time to get through the digestive system of that animal that just ate it. That monkey looks stoked. Okay, another way for seeds to get around is to just attach themselves to animals. So instead of being attractive and fleshy, they will just dupe an animal and just attach their entire seed pod or their fruit, in other words, to their fur, or to your sock, or to the leg of a deer, or something like that. These are, in other words, these are burrs, right? Maybe you've had experience with burrs. Yeah, some plants definitely like to be attached to the fur of mammals and get around that way. Or birds, whatever. The truth is that there's all sorts of other techniques that angiosperms have evolved for getting their babies around. In theory, they want their babies to not land directly below them, because then the mother plant might shade them out, especially if it's a tree or something. And so maybe their fruit will sort of have wings like this, something that will be able to catch the wind. Or maybe there'll be a delicious nut where a squirrel will stash them and hoard a bunch of nuts and forget about them. And now you've got this little underground storage unit of a bunch of your fruits, of your babies, from the plant's perspective, right? Some other fruits actually have ballistic dispersal, where they'll sort of shoot out a seed. And actually, we see that over here, too. Others just sort of open up to release their seed and sort of use something more or less like gravity or wind to just sort of get their seeds around. Okay, now this is a massive phylogeny. Please don't spend too much time looking at it. I just wanted you to know that there are people who spend a lot of time thinking about the relationships between all of these 350,000 species of angiosperms. And really, a lot of them are pretty resolved. A lot of these groups of angiosperms are pretty well understood at this point. But they're in the process of becoming well understood. And so sometimes names have to change. Sometimes, for example, you have to keep an open mind. Maybe something that I've taught you in this class might even change in a year or two or 10 years or something. Just like things that I learned 10 or a long time ago, years ago in college have changed, right? Okay. So, last cool thing. Well, I guess not last cool thing. Another super cool thing about angiosperms, besides fruits, flowers, double integument, double fertilization, all this other stuff, they also got an upgrade to their vascular system. Namely, they got vessel cells. Vessel cells are a huge improvement because they have a really wide diameter. And they're able to allow more water to flow through them. And so they're sort of more effective at getting water around than gymnosperms. Just another upgrade that we can add to our cladogram, because we're going to build a smaller, simplified cladogram. So I'd like you to draw an embryophyte tree, showing the three groups basal to the angiosperms, the bryophytes, the seed-free vascular plants, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms themselves. Now, it's up to you if you wanted to expand on the bryophytes and the gymnosperms and sort of expand to the degree that you now know them from your other cladograms you've been kind of looking at and building on from previous weeks, or if you just want to group them in those small groups, just bryophytes, seed-free vascular plants. And the angiosperms themselves. Add the following synapomorphic characters for angiosperms: flowers, double fertilization, endosperm, fruit, and vessel cells. Let's see if you can do that on your own, and then see if you get the same answer as me. So I'm going to change the screen here. Feel free to pause it if you're still working on yours. I know you wouldn't have gotten it done just now, so you should probably pause it. Okay, so here's part of it, at least. Oh, frozen. Sometimes my screen freezes. There we go. All right, well, I didn't draw everything that I just asked you to draw. I just drew the gymnosperms. Sorry about that. And you've got the spermatophytes, which is really just another word for seed plants, okay? And so that's going to include the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. By the way, really, another term for angiosperms is anthophyta. Notice it's got the ophyta ending, so that means it's a phylum. So that's kind of nice. to have that consistency there, if you'd like to call angiosperms Anthophyta. They are sort of synonymous. We do have these groups of angiosperms. We've got some sort of basal angiosperms. That just means basal as in like ancestral groups, meaning that they're more ancestral to the monocots and the eudicots. Now, in a few minutes here, I'm going to show you a couple of differences between these two groups, the monocots and the eudicots, which it's really just, again, just nice to know for your own identification purposes. But I'm not going to like make you tell me, is this a monocot or a eudicot, you know. But anyway, okay. Gymnosperms, angiosperms, they all have seeds and ovules and sort of everything that goes along with an ovule. So that remember, the megasporangium never opens. The megaspore is not released. The megagametophyte is retained in the megaspore. All of those things sort of have to do with the seed and the ovule. That's what I mean by ... there. Okay. And pollination. The gymnosperms, they still had pollination. Theirs was just all wind pollination. So it's right here that you would have added the synapomorphies for all of the angiosperms, because this point right here implies that everyone sort of above this point has that trait, and then nobody below this point has that trait. Okay, so all of the angiosperms have the flower. They've got a carpel, pollination, double integument, double fertilization, endosperm. Oh yeah, okay. And now, as promised, here's the differences between monocots and eudicots. These are just two major groups within the angiosperms where the vast majority of flowers fall into one of these two groups, and so it's just kind of cool to know. It's just kind of cool to know. And I talked about it way earlier in the semester in light of stem and root growth, because stem and root growth differs between monocots and eudicots. Oh, and same with the leaves. So actually, let's start there since it's old. The stems of monocots have their vascular bundles scattered, while the vascular bundles are in a ring for the dicots. And it's this ring formation that allows eudicots, to be able to undergo secondary growth. And in other words, eudicots can form wood. Monocots cannot form wood. I don't know. I shouldn't have done an X there, because that makes you think xylem. But I meant an X for you cannot. They cannot form wood. Okay, another thing I think we briefly talked about earlier in the semester, eudicots tend to have net-like venation, where the veins will sort of split, branch, come back into contact with each other. The venation of monocots is they're parallel, and so those veins never come into contact with each other. They always run next to each other. Okay, some other big differences now we've talked about these things is in monocots, we tend to have sepals and petals in multiples of 3. So either 3 or 6 petals. That's very common in the monocots. While in the eudicots, we have either 4 or 5 petals. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals here. Okay, sometimes they also have 4 petals, but usually not 3 or 6. Okay, the pollen thing, that's cool. I'm not going to talk about that. You can read if you want. The other big difference is, and this is where the name monocot and eudicot comes from, it's from the cotyledons. Eudicots have 2 cotyledons in their seeds, while monocots have 1 cotyledon in their seed. Neat. Moving on. So yeah, folks think the best estimate is that flowers evolved approximately 150 million years ago. At least the common ancestor of all angiosperms was approximately that old, and that ancestor is no longer around, and so we don't know the exact story of the evolution between gymnosperms and angiosperms. But it's really fun and interesting to get closer and closer to figuring that truth out as genetics are improving and fossils are being found. This is a really exciting time to be studying plants. And that's all I've got for you for now. So please feel free to come to my office hours, especially this week. I know you might have a lot of questions about flowers because they are maybe the most well-known group of plants, and we've only started talking about them just second to last week of school. Crazy. Anyway, I hope you like learning about flowers and fruits, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Bye.